Ladies and gentlemen, your Artemis II crew.
This is an amazing opportunity, and it's an amazing time in history. We're sending people to the moon. I mean, getting people to the moon and back is a significant thing, and it's something we should celebrate. And when we announce the Artemis III crew or the Artemis IV crew, we'll be excited for that too, but this is a great time.
They could only be first one time. And after that, it's a job of work. And sadly, a lot of people don't remember the third man that walked on the moon, Pete Conrad. I remember, but that's part of history. That big event that causes all the excitement, that's the one they remember. And after that, it's routine. It's get back to work. So I think that's what you should expect.
Yeah, the flight rate is pretty low, and none of us will fly another Artemis mission likely, but it'll still be something to celebrate. And I'm just happy for our agencies and our countries that we get to be a part of this time right now.
Why don't you just jump there and land? Because Artemis I was a success.
You need a lander. It's not ready.
The Orion capsule is how the humans will get off the planet, get to lunar orbit, and get back to Earth. And that's the part we'll test on this mission. But the lander will be built by SpaceX. Starship is at least one of the landers that the United States is going to build, and that is what will take humans back down from lunar orbit to the surface of the moon.
The people who go on that first ride out around the moon are going to get a heck of a view, but they're not going to land. A lot of that will require Musk's SpaceX. If his big Starship doesn't pass muster here pretty soon, that's going to put a real block in the schedule.
Obviously, they still have a lot more work to do. There's some challenges there that they're going to have to work through. But what I would tell you is, we have multiple approaches. This isn't just a one-shot wonder. We're using different rockets, different infrastructure, different partnerships, and I think it's a smart approach.
Back to the moon and beyond.
Overall, it's incredible how everything was so successful and how all of the systems performed like they should have. And I got to give it to the Mission Control Center at Houston. What they did during those 20 plus days of the Artemis I was just incredible. They had to figure out lots of things that happened real time and how to keep going with the mission and how to execute all of the mission objectives, and they did.
The Artemis I mission was intended as a kind of validation of concept, right? So we had the rocket, the spacecraft had some rudimentary life support systems on board, but not the full environmental control and life support.
It didn't have crew waste systems, it didn't have food systems, so it didn't have a lot of the things that we need to fly crew on board. It was really an engineering test of the spacecraft, the propulsion systems, the thermal protection system, the structures, the avionics. This is going to test also now the life support systems and all the environmental systems that needed to support our crew members.
We absolutely have lessons to work on. We have a lessons learned process going on right now that culminates from top to bottom. And we have a couple things that we're working on there, a couple boxes that operated a little bit differently than we expected. Never put the mission in jeopardy or missed a flight test objective. We have some work to do on the heat shield that we're trying to understand. So flawlessly, I would say, is a good word, but it doesn't mean without some things that we still need to look at and work on.
Splashdown. Orion, back on Earth.
It's not that we're back to that old technology. It's you got to think about the requirements, the size of the vehicle, the weight of the vehicle, the speed we're coming back at. It's way faster than shuttle. The design and the requirements drove you to a capsule, and those decisions were made a while back. But they went through multiple straight studies to figure out: is it better to do recovery with a capsule with parachute? Is it better to do a recovery where you have a vehicle that lands flying into the atmosphere?
You need a force to slow you down, and if you're not using the atmosphere, then you need an engine or a rocket, and you need fuel for that. So if you take that fuel with you, then you're carrying that fuel all the way to the moon, and you're bringing it all the way back. That's the beauty of the direct entry, is you don't need that. You utilize the Earth's atmosphere to slow you down, and you don't carry any extra weight with you out to the moon.
SpaceX does land on the water, so they also made a decision, and they land also with parachutes with their human spacecraft, and they got there too. They decided this is probably, based on our requirements, based on bringing the risk down, that this is the safest method to do it. Because some people do it different. You know, the commercial crew vehicle from Boeing actually lands on land with airbags that deploy before it. Soyuz lands on land, and right before it lands, it's the fire or thruster, but everybody actually uses parachutes. And why do we use parachutes? Because we found that it's the best way to slow the vehicle down. It's the best way to give us redundancy and risk. You can just see that every company, every government agency makes those trades and ends up making decisions based on their vehicle, what their requirements are, and what risk tolerance they're willing to accept.
The challenges of re-entering the atmosphere at Mach 25, 11 kilometers per second, they haven't changed. And it turns out the shape of spacecraft, in order to efficiently and safely re-enter through the atmosphere at enormous speeds like that, capsule shapes are really optimized well for that. Maybe someday when much more advanced technologies allow airplanes to fly like Star Wars, we're a long way off for that.
The Orion spaceship is an expansion of Apollo, but it's not Apollo on steroids, as some people have said. It's using current technology to the best effect. It is a larger version of the Apollo design and plan form, but it's pretty spacious, pretty nice, and Lord, the Apollo spacecraft was only about the size of a Volkswagen inside. That's about how much room they had to get around. This one is large and spacious. So yeah, what it is basically all good stuff expanded.
I would say it's a very large SUV, perhaps. It's about 16 and a half feet at its widest point of the cone. Inside there's around 320 cubic feet of living space, so around 80 cubic feet per person. So yeah, imagine going on a long-haul road trip in a very large van.
It's bigger, heavier, more capability to carry a crew. So Apollo had 3, we're carrying 4 crew members. We can, for the further, the Artemis 3, 4, or 5, the intent is to be able to carry 100 kilograms back from the lunar surface. Apollo started at maybe 20, 23, something like that, and it ended up in the 100, low 100s. So the capability to return science is pretty impressive with this Orion vehicle.
Compared to those early spacecraft like Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, I think today's astronauts will feel it's a lot more roomy. They have a long mission to fly, a couple weeks out to the moon and back, and so as part of their health and comfort, you want to provide that space where they can be most efficient at the jobs they're asked to do. Looking at the cockpit itself, again, those old spacecraft had switches everywhere, hundreds of switches and dials in order to manually operate the systems. But with the software we have and the computers, we're able to automate that and collapse the control system to a much more concentrated and inefficient layout. So I would compare it more to like a modern commercial airliner than one of those old spacecraft. Starting at the top with the windows, the commander and pilot will sit side by side, and they have windows that allow them to look out. For example, when they need to rendezvous and dock and see the spacecraft they're approaching, they're able to look at both the instrument panel that's in front of them, as well as the windows that allow them to see outside. Below them, in a 2x2 orientation, is the mission specialists, and they'll be oriented in that configuration for launch and landing. But when they're not in that, they can move around, get out of their seats. There'll be 4 sleeping bags, and in the space station and other things, we allow the crews to sleep where they find it most comfortable. What you see before me, down here at the base of Orion, is the waste collection area. This is the toilet that the astronauts will use for their 3-week mission. Separately, on a different part of the spacecraft, is the food preparation area where they can get drinking water. And naturally, you want to separate where you eat and drink from the waste collection part. Right next to the hatch are these emergency systems. So there's a crew survival bag here, and there's a life raft on board. So in the unlikely event of a problem where the crew needs to get out quickly, you want your emergency supplies right by where you're gonna exit, so they can quickly grab it and go outside. This is our external hatch. It's what protects the crew from the vacuum of space. It's an outward opening hatch, and so what you see oriented around it are latches. Basically keeps the hatch sealed against the pressure of the inside. So all these mechanisms are a way to keep the hatch closed, but also in the event of something really bad, can allow it to open very quickly. The next feature I want to point out is the tunnel that you see right behind me. This tunnel leads to a docking mechanism and a hatch, which once Orion docks to its next spacecraft, whether it's the human landing system or the gateway outpost, it'll make a hard seal in between those spacecraft. The astronauts will float up through this tunnel, they'll remove that hatch, and they'll be able to transfer into their next vehicle.
This is one of the areas we've really benefited from through the shuttle and the International Space Station and the other programs. We've standardized docking mechanisms. The key is going to be to make sure that as we get those parts together, as we get the Orion capsule, and whether that's one lander or another, and I know there's 2 on contract right now, is to make sure the pressure differentials and the temperatures and everything, to make sure that as we open the hatch, everything goes well. The docking themselves is pretty standardized. It's really about making sure that what we would call interface control is done correctly.
On Artemis I, fully autonomous mission control was operating the spacecraft from Houston. So on Artemis II, we are going to
take all of that into the crew's hands and make sure all the backup systems, the manual systems, work the way they should. So if we ever have an anomaly on future Artemis missions, we already know the crew knows how to maneuver the vehicle. They know how to work the communication systems, pointing, get the optical comm system up and running. We know how to configure the cabin. So this will actually be a fairly manual hands-on flight.
The mission itself is different because we want to do some things in a highly elliptic orbit before we commit to go to translunar injection. So there's about a 23.5-hour orbit that we place the spacecraft in to do checkouts of the ecosystem, environmental control, and life support, to make sure that the ecosystem can support 4 crew members, and they'll be doing exercise and trying to stress the ecosystem in that 23.5-hour orbit. We'll also do a proximity operation where we have the crew members manually pilot the Orion spacecraft. We will have separated from that stage, and we'll do a docking maneuver around the spent stage. So it's really intended to wring out new capabilities that we didn't do on Artemis I.
Whatever we learn from that, then they'll take those lessons and pull it in for our mission on Artemis III. And once we get past Artemis III, I really do believe the rest ones will be they could be as fast as we want them to be.
Ultimately, we need to get to a cadence that we're flying at least once a year, right? And that's on this. Recognize that there'll be a lot of other rockets that will be flying and staging things in space and all that. So we're not dependent on a cadence of flying every few months of a large rocket like this. And I think that's important too. It's a big rocket. It's intended to send big things deep in space.
We actually have hardware right now through Artemis VII. We have contracts through Artemis IX. So on paper, I'd say contracts through 9 and hardware through 7. So I think we're a very hardware-rich program. We'd like to have some more hardware in case we run into some problems along the way. But we're building stuff for Artemis VII today, which is right now Artemis VII is scheduled out in the 2030s. The first iteration of the SLS core stage is obviously focused on returning astronauts to the surface of the moon, which is a feat in and of itself. Beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, we are intending to go to stay. So to do that, we have upgraded variants of the SLS core stage, which have even further thrust capabilities to be able to supply cargo to the astronauts who will be sustaining a long-term presence on the surface of the moon.
Artemis I launch was the Block 1 configuration. The minimum capability for that rocket was in the 70 metric ton range. We have the evolvability of the rocket to take us from a Block 1 to a Block 1B, which is the next step in advancement. It is an upgrade in the second stage propulsion system. The current for the Block 1, the propulsion system is powered by one engine, whereas the Block 1B will have upper stage with 4 engines. To take it from a Block 1B to a Block 2, which is the final of those evolvable states of this hardware, it takes us to about 120 metric ton payload capacity.
The core stage, being the backbone of the propulsion system for the entire vehicle, has approximately an 8-minute duration. That is the lifespan from RS-25 engine ignition sequence to jettison from the upper stages of the vehicle itself, wherein it'll fall back to Earth and disassemble itself safely. Beyond that, the upper stages will continue on with the translunar injection and the different mission profiles.
The orange is the foam on it. It's an insulated foam. And if you look back to the beginning of the space shuttle program, we had a white tank, and that was just because we painted the foam. Well, we realized that the foam was capable of withstanding the environments, and that saves a lot of mass. You know, you were talking about thousands of pounds of paint. Well, if you're not carrying the paint, then you can be carrying other cargo.
Once the SLS core stage is completed here at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, we have a floating barge dock at the facility where we load the core stage onto a purpose-built barge called Pegasus, and the barge takes a sea journey around the tip of Florida and to the East Coast at Cape Canaveral, where we offload at the Kennedy Space Center and transport the core stage into the vertical assembly building there at Kennedy for integration with the remainder of the rocket, the solid rocket boosters, as well as the Orion crew vehicle in preparation for launch.
Well, this is the spacecraft that's used to take men down to the lunar surface. And it's docked to the command module.
I went up to Grumman and took a course in the engineering of the lunar module very early on in the game. First of all, remember that Grumman built Navy fighter planes, things that don't land on decks, they crash. And the lunar module was built every bit as strong as any of their fighter planes. The framework, once you saw inside it, was amazing. The supporting structure went around like ribs, and the thing was really built to take punishment. But it was never built to fly in an atmosphere. So all they did was, once they got the structure, then they just hung sheet metal on it to cover it up.
If you look back at the Apollo landers, they were small, more fragile, and limited time on the moon. The landers that the Human Landing System program is working with contractors to build are those that are more sustainable, long-term, larger, more massive, and they are expected to be launched on other rockets and not concurrent with the crew.
Having a couple of companies is something that the government would have supported one way or another anyway. Having them build it up on their own, the very wealthy entrepreneurs, it's sort of unique. It's very, probably very American solution in a way, but it's not without its costs and potential future problems as well. SpaceX, for example, right now has proved themselves to be reliable. They are the major launch company in the United States. And of course, there's always the risk of monopoly power. Now, just being the only one right now that with a lot of capability is not necessarily bad. Let's see how competition and the situation develops over time. I don't want to make any predictions, but I think we need more than one reliable competitor if we're dealing with private companies in relation to the government.
We have 2 contracts for human landers right now. We have one with SpaceX and one with Blue Origin. We certainly picked SpaceX based on their plans and their capabilities. We have a number of major milestones they have to go through for us. They have to transfer the liquid cryogenic propellant between 2 ships. That's a critical test for us. Then they have to do an uncrewed demo, landing on the surface before even getting to a crew demo.
We want to make sure we have a solid approach for the moon. And so this gives us the opportunity, similar to how commercial crew, they were awarded 2 different providers. You know, at the time it was Boeing and SpaceX to take crew up to International Space Station. And at the time, you know, early on at that award, I would say NASA wasn't really sure who was probably going to be successful first. And we feel like this is a very similar path. We believe both will be successful, and, you know, we just want to make sure we have somebody at the earliest time possible.
We don't have other plans, we don't have other budgets, we don't have other work going on in parallel. Our plan is to land with hopefully both of those contractors, and if it ends up being one of them, then that's who we'll go with, and we'll work with our schedule to adjust for it. But those are our only plans right now for landers.
The size of Starship is around 50 meters tall. The size of the Blue Moon lander is around 16 meters tall. The Starship has an elevator mechanism for the crew to descend to the lunar surface, whereas the Blue Moon lander has a ladder, more traditional and what we're used to seeing. They have different propellants. One's hydrogen, the blue is hydrogen, and SpaceX is methane. In general, though, there's a lot of similarities. They both require multiple launches. The Blue Moon lander also requires propellant transfer and aggregation that occurs in halo orbit, whereas SpaceX is doing all that in low Earth orbit. We'll take Artemis III, for example, which is the first moon landing at the South Pole. So what we will do is the HLS Starship will be the first to launch. There'll be a series of tanking operations. So SpaceX will send up a depot, which is very similar to your gas station. And then they will send up tanker flights. And those tanker flights will fill the depot full of propellant. Then we send the Starship. So the Starship then launches, it docks, and it performs propellant transfer.
We'll actually launch the lander first, and the lander will go up in both architectures and fuel through their cryogenic depots, and then the landers will go into orbit, into our near rectilinear halo orbit, this unique orbit around the moon. For Artemis III, Orion will dock directly to the lander, and the lander will go down to the surface, come back up from the surface, Orion will come home. Future missions, the lander will go up and be serviced, be filled. We'll go to our Gateway, our lunar orbiting space station. Orion will go to Gateway, and the crew will transition into the lander, 2 of the crew, go down to the surface. The other 2 will wait up in Gateway and do science and experiments up there.
I remember people seeing this as a concept in the Apollo days. Space station that'll be in orbit around the moon as a staging base for anything you want to do in that neighborhood.
Well, the Gateway Outpost is currently planned to have a robotic arm, much like the current ISS space station. But the way we plan to help build the Gateway using Orion is to launch big pieces on the SLS rocket. Now, on the way to the moon, Orion will turn around, they'll grab those pieces, and they'll deliver it and dock it to the Gateway. So it's a kind of a piece-by-piece assembly approach.
It's likely that the moon itself and the space station orbiting it in the future will be the way stations, even fueling stations, for rockets that are on their way to Mars in the future.
That's another research platform outside of the Earth's magnetic field where we can really begin to study that deep space environment. Spending time at the Gateway is very similar to traveling to Mars. So we can begin to learn about how does food respond, how do pharmaceuticals respond, how do people respond for that kind of a trip.
It's maybe a 6-month transit out to Mars, let's say best case. We can actually simulate a Mars transit by putting a crew on Gateway for 6 months with the right logistics, and then send them down to the surface of the moon, let them operate for 30 days, come back to Gateway, stay there for 6 months, and then come home. It's like a Mars mission, and we can understand how our systems and how our humans operate after long exposure to space and then operating in a partial gravity environment on the moon.
Living in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station has taught us much about how the body responds to that. For instance, we learned that for longer stays in orbit, there are impacts to bone density and muscle retention. And if you ask someone to be in space for a long period of time and then start doing jobs, maybe on a surface of the moon or maybe even Mars at some point,
We have to understand how their bodies responded to the time and space and what we can expect them reasonably to do once they're on the surface.
For the Artemis missions, our crew members will use different environments than they use just for the space station. So we'll probably still use the neutral buoyancy lab, but this time instead of for microgravity, we'll use it for 1/6 gravity, which is the lunar gravity. And we'll do that by adding additional weights to the suit to weigh you down on the bottom of the pool to mimic what 1/6G might feel like. We also might use Argos, which is the active response gravity offload system, which basically is a smart gimbaling system that can pick up 5/6 of your weight, so you can only feel that 1/6 gravity effect.
There will be geology training, whether that astronaut's background happens to be in geology or another science, or it happens to be from a different area. We've got fundamentals training that we've already started giving to folks in the astronaut office, and definitely those kinds of field trips where you're practicing looking at Earth geological features and choosing what to sample and how to sample it using the tool that they'll have on the moon.
Yeah, I've actually been to the place where they trained the Apollo landed missions. It's in Flagstaff, Arizona. So it's geologically active from a geological time frame. So that's where they'll learn how to use the hammers and the scoops, how to recover with a full suit on, how to recover a rock without tipping over. So it's going to be very different training for them.
Now, there is no perfect example of the moon here on Earth. The only place that's identical to the moon is the moon itself. But we can begin to show them the types of features that we would expect them to encounter on the moon. All of it is just to give them as much background knowledge as possible so that when they get there, they can go do that work and they're not caught off guard by what they're seeing.
So Apollo was trained in this facility, but all of that equipment has been sent out to museums, and so we don't have any of the computers or the mock-ups or the simulators left in this building. Everything is from scratch. This simulator specifically is for the training of the entire team as well as the crew. It's scalable so that it can be focused on specific events, or it can train the entire scenarios from ascent to lunar transit, and then as well as entry.
For Artemis II, which is primarily focused on SLS and Orion, the crew gets training on how to monitor the launch and respond to any contingencies that happen during that time. Once they're on orbit, they need to interact with the vehicle, understand what the software is doing, when they might need to intervene and be a part of the process for those operations in space. Of course, they need to learn to live in the Orion vehicle, and then when the mission is complete, learning how to make sure that they can safely re-enter the atmosphere, that their parachutes have deployed, and once they splash down in the water, how to power down the vehicle.
It definitely gets more complex for Artemis III because we're adding the lunar lander, which has to go now undock from Orion, go down to the surface of the moon. Then we're adding the EVA, so they have to learn to do a spacewalk. They have to learn certain science skills so they can collect the right samples and gather the right data. And then they have to traverse safely back across the lunar surface, which also is something new and different. And then take off from the surface and re-rendezvous and dock again with the Orion. So from that perspective, it's definitely more dynamic, and there's a lot of additional training on top of it.
Apollo 17 flew a professional geologist astronaut, and prior to that, the astronauts were military. But all of those astronauts were given science training. They had hundreds, in some cases over 1,000 hours of geology, geoscience training to help educate them for the job we were asking them to do when they got to the surface of the moon. They understood that technology would advance at a pace they maybe didn't understand at all. And they knew that some of the samples they collected might be better analyzed with future capabilities. And so a set of samples were maintained in a sealed status and were not measured or opened or analyzed in any way. Recently, NASA has begun to look at some of those samples, in particular samples that we actually sealed.
Science in the very beginning of the human space program was not a big factor. Engineering was the big factor. And science was a hitchhiker on the way to the moon. They realized they had to do science on the moon. Could not be very easily explained why we were there. The fact that we're going back to the moon now just seems like it's all built up and it's time to do it.
We're going to the South Pole, where Apollo went to the equator, where there's more history of the universe captured at the South Pole. 3 billion years history at the equator, 4 to 4.5 billion at the South Pole. What we're looking for at the South Pole are the minerals that are there, the water ice. We want to understand, can we use that water ice? Can we use those minerals to learn to live off the land? That water ice gives us tremendous capability to split the hydrogen and oxygen, use it for power in fuel cells, to use the water itself in our life support systems.
That ice could record the history of the entire solar system evolution. And if we can access it and study it, now we're starting to talk about the Earth-Moon system and the history of humankind and life in general. That is basically the marker point for us to help understand everything we'll observe in the solar system.
The moon right now is a location for scientific and diplomatic endeavors. It's not clear if it's going to be economically useful, but that's what exploration is about. It might be useful. Whether or not there is something there that could make money that would justify a completely private investment, that's still really unknown. There are speculations like mining helium-3 off the lunar surface. There's speculations about mining asteroids, but those things are still fairly far in the future.
NASA have really invested commercially in the moon. We have our services contracts. We have services for our landers. Similarly, we're not buying the spacesuits. We're buying a couple suits waiting in the lander for our crews to get into.
We have 2 different vendors that have been awarded that contract. So we have Axiom Space and then also Collins Aerospace. So they both have been awarded to provide suits to NASA, basically as a rental services. So you can kind of use that analog of renting a car. So you don't necessarily, when you fly to a new place, you don't buy a new car. When you get there, you can rent one. And so NASA will be doing something similar, and that will help reduce the cost for the government to be able to do the Artemis missions, and also help open up the commercial market for not just NASA and the government to use these spacesuits, but also commercial vendors can come in and use those spacesuits as well. Since Axiom and Collins will own the suit design, they'll own the suit hardware.
There's a different set of suits that the astronauts wear for liftoff and re-entry, but they're more focused on just providing pressure suits capability to keep them alive in the event of a problem. The different suits you need to explore the moon, it's a very dusty environment. Those will launch on the lander and be waiting for the crew once they get there.
Dust ended up being more of a significant problem in the Apollo program than it was initially thought to be. So the lunar dust is very sharp, so it's like minuscule glass pieces because there is no erosion features on the lunar surface. So there is not wind that's making that dust not be nearly as abrasive like we're used to here on Earth.
They took their suits on and off inside their living habitat. So we recognize that there is the possibility to bring a good amount of dust into your living environment. In later Apollo missions, they began reporting that that was irritating to them, to their eyes, to their breathing. So that's something we would want to try and minimize as much as possible.
With the lunar missions, even though they were only 3, 4, or 5 days, that lunar dust could get into the fabric and could start to abrade the fabric. The Apollo suits also use zippers and they use cables. And both those things, when you add dust to them, don't work very well. And so we need to have more dust-resistant designs that can handle that lunar dust over a long mission. So those suits were made for both in your capsule and also to go EVA. So they were both an intravehicular activity suit and an extravehicular activity suit. So they form both functions. One of the downsides of having a suit that does both functions and not to make it optimized is they didn't have a lot of mobility, especially in the lower torso, in the Apollo suits because it was a completely soft pressure garment. So you didn't have things like bearings and hard goods that help give some mobility back to the crew member. So that's why when you watch the Apollo missions, they bounced around on the lunar surface, they fell a lot, they couldn't get down to the surface to work with tools because their spacesuits weren't built to have that mobility in mind. Because you don't want to have some of those hard components in your suit when you're coming back to Earth and landing in the ocean, and that hard impact, you need your suit to protect you. So now we have suits that are optimized just for that EVA function, and so we can have more mobility. So the suits that are going to be built for the Artemis mission are going to have more mobility than Apollo. So they're going to be able to walk easier, kneel, squat, be able to do the geological science tasks that they're going to be asked to do during that mission more effectively and more efficiently. One of the big things about the Apollo missions and the Apollo spacesuits in particular is those suits were all custom for crew members, and they were specifically built for just those crew members and backups in mind. So there was usually 5 suits made for each seat, is what they said. So you had, for the current flight crew, a training suit, a backup suit, and your flight suit. And then your backup crew also had a flight suit and a training suit. And as the missions went on, each suit cost more and more, and you'd have to make all these different suits, and so it wasn't very economical. So really during shuttle, we started to make modular suits. And this also helped open up a bigger range of sizes that we can fit. And so now for the EMU that they use right now on the space station, you have different components, small, medium, large. You can mix and match and be able to fit a larger crew member and crew population. And we want to continue that for the Artemis missions.
We're looking to our partners to be innovative in their solutions and creation of things like suits and rovers and habitats and anything. So we have 2 companies that we're looking to help us with landing. We have multiple companies that are helping us build a gateway. NASA recognizes that if you try to go and explore space as an individual agency, it's probably going to be very difficult. That's why we have established the Artemis Accords, so that we can begin having conversations about how we work together, how our nations treat each other in space as we try to go do this bold endeavor together.
We're talking about that safe, transparent, peaceful, and prosperous exploration. And part of that is, number one, respecting historical sites. We feel it's very important to respect the Apollo sites and not disturb those for what they did for humanity. Secondly, we want to make sure that where we land, we also respect other folks' sites that have landed there. We certainly want to be respectful of the resources that are on the moon and not claim territory. That's one of the fundamental premises of the Artemis Accords.
China landed an uncrewed spacecraft on the far side of the moon. The successful mission elevates China's space power status in a global rush to the moon.
We're in a space race with China. I don't want China to get to the South Pole first with humans and then say, this is ours, stay out.
Chinese have been operating a space station themselves for quite a while. and they've made great advances on the moon. So right away you have a competitive stage. I think that the Chinese give every indication of being extremely serious about what they're doing, that they have the technology, they know the technology, and they're using it full force.
Some people think that if we can cooperate in space, that will have a positive effect on political relationships. Really, it's the other way around. If there are good political situations, then space becomes some way of marking that, commemorating it, demonstrating it. So if the political relationships are there, the space cooperation follows as a way of making that tangible and visible. If the political situation is not there, space cooperation simply is not going to occur.
On behalf of the United States and the American people, let me just tell you all how delighted we are and how pleased I am to be able to congratulate you on this momentous occasion.
At times, they've been very welcome competitors and very welcome partners in all of this. We've drifted out of that now. One of the breaking points, I think, within NASA was the price of rides on the Soyuz to the space station. The truth of the matter is, Russia could have kept us off the space station if they wanted to. But I did notice that the price of a seat for an American astronaut went up every time we flew it. That was not good in terms of goodwill between the two of us. It didn't help much. And when Musk came along with his spaceship that could transport American astronauts, it was a big relief.
Technically speaking, Russia is still very capable. And they have rockets, they have the capability to do things politically, economically. They're in a different position now. And of course, China has invested extremely fast and heavily into space technologies, is at today, anyway, our major competitor in moon programs.
We worked through space station in an era where the US and Russia were tenuous at times. And we still continue to work together on that program. So that's when I think of times when you can rise above things to work together on goals, I think space and science is an area where we can do that. So it gives me hope that we can in the future.
The thing about the moon is it has many different price points. It has things that are really major, like pressurized rover, they're billions of dollars. It has things that are fairly small, fairly affordable, that a developing country can do.
When I think about how we cooperate with both other nations and companies, the word competition doesn't come to mind, but the word cooperation does. One of NASA's missions, stated missions, is actually enabling a space economy. And every time we do something, we enable a market, we create a market. Every time we take something that has never been done before and show that it is not only doable, but that there could be a market around it, that is a success for NASA.
It's always fun to think about the future, right? What our plans are right now is to begin placing hardware that we can reuse. We want to leave tools behind. We want to leave rovers on the surface that can explore when our astronauts are not there.
First landing, and then we go to Artemis IV, where we have Gateway in place, and it'll be our first mission where we land from Gateway, and we have 2 crews staying on Gateway doing the science that I mentioned. Then we'll go to Artemis V, where our plans right now are to have our lunar terrain vehicle waiting for the crew on Artemis V as they come down from Gateway. That will allow them to go much further on the surface. And then we get on to Artemis VI, where we'll probably add the airlock to Gateway, which means we can do spacewalks from Gateway to do repairs or do science or enhance Gateway. Then we'll move on from there with our pressurized rover, which is basically the crew can drive about 20 kilometers on the surface in a shirt sleeve environment and do their spacewalks from there, place their science experiments, bring rocks back from a different place. And then we'll be going just about every year, where we'll eventually add a surface habitation capability. Eventually, after that, we're trying to get to 4 crews to stay for 30 days.
I would love to see a complex of buildings that included a habitat, some manufacturing. Can we take the regolith and do something useful with it that we don't have to bring from Earth, that we can build maybe part of those habitats from that. So first is a good habitat. And then I think outside of that, it'll be the things that characterize any good civilization, which would include science, exploration, and would include art at the end of the day.
I think it'd be very similar to the Antarctic science bases, the various nations that have bases at Antarctica. And if we can come to a common agreement, the law that works in Antarctica ought to apply to the moon pretty well, I would think. So you probably have scattered bases among the competitors, and who knows, we might even have cooperation between them.
I think we're a few years from a lot of habitats on there. I know how difficult it is to get a lander and a rover down there in RHAB, and I believe we have a tremendously capable team to do it.
And that might not be on the surface of the moon, that might be in orbit around the moon. That may be the jump-off point from which we leave to go to Mars. That's all part of this open concept of considerations we have to take into account, right?
I think people will be very fascinated by when we look at technologies such as nuclear thermal propulsion, and that is a deep space technology that NASA and industry partners are championing to be able to pilot our astronauts from the lunar exploration and lunar orbital launch pads that will orbit the moon to perhaps the surface of Mars or other heavenly bodies.
I've heard one of our senior leaders say, the destination may be the same, but we're different. Our technology has advanced, our surveillance has developed, and there's just more things to explore. And that's one reason that I believe that the moon mission is still a viable mission.
The technical end of this isn't the same challenge that it was in the 1960s. Even today, launching a rocket does not have the reliability that getting on an airplane has become. Rockets do fail. Space is a harsh and rough environment. That's one of the things that makes it expensive. It isn't a question of whether we can. It is a question of when and how much money we invest in it.
I am confident when Christopher Columbus went and asked Queen Isabella for the money to send ships all the way around the world, that there were people that thought that was foolish. There's plenty of food, there's plenty of capability where they could not envision the world that was opened up and the exploration that occurred after that first voyage. And similarly, I don't think our imagination is sufficient to imagine where we're headed in this great quest.